The Florida Podcast Network, the voice of Florida.
From Mallory Square in Key West to the Governor's Mansion in Tallahassee and all points beyond, you're listening to the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com, your source for all things related to the craft beer community in the Sunshine State. And now your host, Dave Butler.
The only reason I'm saying this in English is that I did not have the chance to go in and fire up Duolingo long enough to try to figure out how to say hello in Belgian or German or whatever. Anyways, hello. Welcome to another episode of the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com. This is Dave, your host and author, and we are drinking Belgian-style beers today, and I cannot be happier. I love Belgian styles. They are literally my absolute favorite. Give me a triple or a quad, and I am a very, very happy camper. Of course, there's some great Belgian beers in Belgium, as to be expected. But you know something? Florida's got some good stuff too. And one of the best Belgian-style breweries in the state is in Palm Beach County in the unsuspecting, unexpected city of Boca Raton. That is, of course, Barrel of Monks. They've been brewing and releasing their beers for years now, and they have managed to create quite the following with obviously their single, double, triple, quad lineup, and also their White Wizard Wit beer, which is found on many a tap in South Florida. Barrel Monks was founded by four men, two of which, Bill McFee and Kevin Abbott, are joining us on today's show and next week's show to talk about everything that it came to creating a Belgian beer mecca in Boca, of all places. So we'll be chatting with them about what got them into beer and Belgian beer specifically, all the fun that it took bringing a Belgian-style brewery to a city not necessarily known for its craft beer scene, and much, much, much more. So hopefully you have a nice big glass bomber, kind of the heavy ones of some amazing, amazing beer ready to crack open. Now's the time to do it and listen to Bill McFee and Kevin Abbott, co-founders of Barrel of Monks Brewing, Part 1. Enjoy. There seem to be craft beer drinkers, and there seems to be people that love everything. And then there's that group that just loves Belgians. Why Belgians?
Why Belgians?
Why Belgian beer? I mean, people are nice, I'm assuming.
Why Belgian people?
Why Belgian people?
Why are there Belgians, and why do people love Belgian beer? Why people love Belgian beer? Hopefully for the same reason that I do, which is because I think they're more complex and more interesting in flavor profiles than a lot of the standard beers, a lot of the typical American beers.
So I guess when did you start getting into them? Because even now, even with the explosion of craft beer, Belgian and Belgian styles still aren't quite there. They were, a couple of years ago, but that crest is starting to roll back. When did you start really jumping in?
Actually, that was in about 1990. I spent a year in New York, and that's the first place I'd seen Belgian beer. And it made me want to take a trip to Belgium. I went to Belgium, learned a lot more about them over there, and just fell in love with them.
And then how did you get into... Did you get into Belgian or Belgian beer?
No,
okay, there we go.
No, that's not really true. So I started my craft beer adventure in Belgian beer because it was the most different from everything else I'd ever had. So I found a little craft beer bar called Coffee District in Delray Beach, Florida. And at that time, it was one of the few places, other than Funky Buddha, there's a couple places where you could get really, really interesting, complex, different craft beer. And I think it was, Saxo, Nostradamus, Delirium Tremens. I don't think I had Chimay early on. It was those kind of beers that I tried. And I thought I knew beer because I drank Sierra Nevada Pale Ale from time to time. I thought I knew beer because I once brought a Killian's Irish Red to a party when I was 19. And I thought that made me pretty cool. But this was the first time I had a beer of that quality that was that different. I mean, using the flavors coming from the yeast, there's candy sugar, there's all this stuff that we do not utilize, or at least did not utilize those kind of things in American brewing. And it blew my mind. So I was an early adopter in my craft beer journey was with Belgians. And then I kind of, got into IPAs, imperial stouts, porters, lagers, all the other stuff. And then it was really Bill and Matt and Keith that kind of wooed me back into the world of Belgians, because I had gotten tired of American breweries with under-attenuated, one-note, bubblegum, banana, one-dimensional Belgians, which not every, but the vast majority of American breweries were doing. And it was like Bill going, hey, have you had a, St. Bernard's Christmas ale? Have you had some of these great beers? And I had a bad opinion that was turned completely on its head because my friends and my eventual business partners.
Gotcha. But it's got to be difficult for you to have sourced your beers for you and sourced the Belgian beers for him, going to Belgium, going to the source after having been in New York, which probably had a much bigger pipeline than we did, and then coming back to South Florida where you had a couple options.
Very true. When I came back to South Florida in 1991, there was nothing here. I mean, until Coffee District, it was very hard to find Belgian beer at all. I used to have to order it and have it shipped in, which probably technically wasn't legal, but hey, whatever.
Statute of limitations is passed.
Yeah, exactly. Can't arrest me for that now, but that was a long time ago.
And then eventually you and a couple of who are now your business partners started to brew this yourselves, correct?
Yeah, so we started brewing it really with the intention of forming the business. So it wasn't really home brewing as a first project. We were lovers of Belgian beer, and Kevin and Keith and Matt and I used to sit on my patio and try different styles. And then I got challenged at one point, said, we think you could learn to make beer this good. And I said, nah, no way. But we gave it a shot and started brewing on the patio. And at that point, decided we were going to start this business. So.
Now, had you brewed other styles before? And as such, what makes a Belgian style beer a different brewing process in some way, shape, or form than if you were to brew a pale, if you were to brew an IPA, if you were to brew a brown ale, porter?
The basic process is the same. It's the ingredients that are different. First of all, the yeast. Really, as I've told many people, everything about Belgian beer really is the yeast. The types of yeast that are used in most American pale ales, IPAs, are pretty standard, and frankly, although that's changing a little bit, and we can get into that in a little bit, but it was for many years very standard, and there was maybe 3 or 4 different types of yeast that were commonly used to brew American ales. And then, but you look for Belgian yeast strains, and there are 50, 60 different varieties of it. One of the fun things about doing the homebrew project was trying all those different yeast strains. There are so many that you just keep. I would do sometimes one batch of beer and do it with 3 or 4 different yeast strains to try to see what was the difference with the same ingredients, different yeast strain each time. And that's what really makes all the flavors very interesting. The esters and phenols that are created by the yeast make Belgian beer interesting to me.
And I'll add that it's not just the yeast, and it's also the fermentation temperature. So you can manipulate fermentation temperature by 3 to 5 degrees one way or the other, and you'll get a completely different beer out of it, which traditionally, when Bill was getting into craft beer, when I was first starting brewing, that wasn't California ale yeast, which was what a lot of people use, doesn't do that. It's just a workhorse to produce alcohol and CO2. It doesn't produce flavor compounds. So the variability of the amount of yeast, how you can manipulate the yeast, then throw in Belgian candy sugar, then throw in all the amazing malts that you can use when you're doing malt-driven beers. And you've just got this wide breadth of flavor profiles that you can create.
Now, what about water profiles? Because obviously, being a specific style that's focused on a very specific region, they would, I would assume, have a very specific water profile that you would theoretically want to try to mimic as much as possible.
That's true to some degree, but I think it's less important than most of the other components. Honestly, if you've got a medium amount of hardness in your water, they typically don't do beers with really soft water, and they don't do beers with really super hard water. So, kind of a medium salt profile in the water is what you're looking for. So, I don't think it's that critical in Belgians.
Gotcha. Now, how did the two of you get together with your two business partners? I'm going to go into your career here in a few seconds, Bill, because there's a couple questions that I've had on my mind to ask you for years, literal years, that I've wanted to get into. But how did you two get into starting to brew these styles of beers with the eventual idea of opening where we are currently sitting today?
Well, you have to start with Bill there, because him, Matt, and Keith were doing this years before I got involved. So, Bill, that would be your...
So, I met Kevin. He was a very good friend, and so we hung out together a lot. And we both, in addition to other things, shared a common love of great beer. And so that's how we got started talking about it. Same thing with Matt and Keith. It was just friendship that developed into friendship, with one of the commonalities being our love of craft beer, and particularly Belgian beer, that developed into conversations about maybe we should start a business. That was the hot thing at that time. We saw craft breweries starting up and decided maybe we should stick our neck out and try that.
And I came on board. Basically, they were friends together for quite a while, and I was the brewer over at Funky Buddha Lounge over in Boca Raton. There was a group called the Boca Beer Lovers that was around at that time. They used to come in and do tastings and, a monthly meetup. Often would do it at the Funky Buddha. So that my first exposure to Bill and Matt and Keith was at Funky Buddha as the brewer at the lounge and from the Boca Beer Lovers.
Right.
That's kind of amazing. I will say this about your current, soon-to-be former career, because you are a retired radiologist, which is wild, because you talk to plenty of brewers and they all come, got some former teachers, some former engineers, some former military. Very rarely do you have anybody come from the medical side.
It does seem to be a little bit unusual, but,
A lot of scientists over there. That's good for brewing.
But that's exactly what I was going to get at. Did that give you a little bit of leg up when it came to the science and the...
Absolutely. As in my schooling, I had a good deal of biology, and a good part of making beer is biology. It's biochemistry. It's yeast and how yeast processes sugars. And so I had a leg up on that. I had a basic science background. And so between chemistry and biology and biochemistry, those are significant components of learning to make good beer.
And obviously with the beers that you're making, if you're making Belgian style beers, you've obviously got to hit the forefathers, I guess, the single, double, triple, and quad. Knowing that those are very ubiquitous, very beloved, and very known styles. At what point did you finally get those recipes down to where you said, okay, we can go ahead and open up a business with these particular recipes? Like, we have the basics where we want them.
Well, there's a little story behind that, because one thing that I knew is that I wasn't going to be willing to put my name on beers, on Belgian style beers, unless we could make a really good triple. So the first beer we ever homebrewed was a triple, and I'm sure brewed that 40 or 50 times with different yeast strains and different temperatures. The recipe for a Belgian triple is pretty simple, basically. It's pretty basic, but there's still a huge variety in the flavor profiles. And so if you sample Belgian style triples in America all over the place, you'll find that they taste all over the map. And that's because there's so many different ways to get it done. So yeah, that was what I wanted to do. And I had something in mind that I was looking for in the flavor profile, and finding the right yeast strain and the right temperature to get those goals accomplished was a challenge. But we finally got to where we got 3 fates, and very happy with it. Kevin?
Bill is the North Star to the brewery when it comes to quality and comparing these beers very harshly in our own self-critique of the beers, and trying to have something in your mind that you're trying to obtain as far as the beers lining up with the classic styles. We've had the joy of doing collaborations with a couple Belgian breweries that came in, and these were connections that Bill made over the years. And probably the nicest thing you can hear from a Belgian brewery, a very good Belgian brewery, is, yeah, that's good. Like that's a good triple. and you did it well. It might not be my triple. It might be a little less phenolic than my triple. It might be have a little more caramelized malt than my triple, but you ticked the boxes and you made a good triple. It's understated, but that means a lot to us, and that's all on Bill.
And I find it interesting that you specifically mentioned the triple because, as we were talking about before we recorded, if a brewery in the state, and I'll use Funky Buddha, for example, if they're going to brew a Belgian beer, more often than not, it's going to be a triple. I remember Triple Lindy from years and years and years ago, and we were talking about another brewery that cans a triple right now. Do you think it's because there is so much room for, I guess, wiggle room within the recipe? And
I think it's because in general, blonde beers are more popular than dark beers, and it's just more accessible. I think it's generally easier on the eyes, and therefore a lot of people aren't as afraid of it. So they'll go for it, whereas they might not go for a quad or a double.
Dark beers are scary. I mean, I've been wanting to make brown ales and red ales happen in South Florida for 15 years now, and there's a reason why they haven't. There's a reason why New Belgium just reformatted Fat Tire. It is no longer an amber ale. It's a blonde beer. I should say that from my understanding, I haven't had it yet. I'm going to have it actually this week. And
it is a blonde beer.
Yeah, so thank you for confirming that. There's a reason why Sam Adams Boston Lager has taken out some of the hop profile and stuff to make the beer a little bit lighter and cleaner. The American palate, even in the craft beer world, if you're not talking about candy bar stouts, they're looking for the lighter color beers. They're looking for cleaner. And that triple visually lines up with those expectations so that you can get the crossover people. The non-craft beer drinker will be more likely to give it a try than they will a big scary quad or even a double, which is lighter, sometimes even more clean, sometimes even more drinkable, sometimes even drier, but is brown, so it's scary.
But knowing all of that information, knowing those trends in thought when it comes to the normal beer drinker, when it came time to open, why did you decide to still go forward with Belgian beers? And why in the craft beer mecca that is Boca?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, Boca, the answer is easy. We all lived here. And so, I mean, we did actually, when we were looking to site the brewery, check out Pompano Beach and Deerfield Beach and even as far north as Boynton, but never could find the ideal spot. And this building where we're sitting right now became an option. And so it seemed to be the right choice. And that's where we lived. And so it's easy for us to be at work here and be at work elsewhere because we all had other day jobs when we got this thing started. So that's why Boca. And why Belgians? Again, it was because this really was a passion project. This was something that we all wanted to do out of the love of the product. And so that's what we really loved.
It was barrel monks or bust. The whole thing was conceived. We were not going to open this brewery and do an IPA. And now that we may be doing those kind of beers now and using non-Belgian yeast, it took 7 years for us to make that the decision. But from the very beginning, it was Belgian or bust.
And I find it interesting because when you first opened, it was only Belgians. And we'll talk about the natural progression later on, but it was strictly Belgian. In fact, I do remember my first visit here. The first thing I got was the 4, single, double, triple, quad. With Boca being what it was, because I think maybe the lounge was open at the time that Barrel of Monks opened.
Oh, the lounge was open for over 3 years before. Okay. Yeah, we came in later on. We were 2015, and I believe I started brewing at the lounge in 2011.
Gotcha.
2009, even maybe as early as that. I can't remember.
What was the sell like to Boca in general? How difficult was that?
It was very difficult. We were the first production brewery of any kind, except for, and the lounge wasn't a production brewery. It was a draft only, local sales only brewery, sort of a brew pub. I think that was their license they had, was a brew pub license. And so we were the first production brewery, and it was a hard sell in Boca, to be honest with you. They didn't know anything about, the city council didn't know anything about breweries, even though they had one in their backyard.
There's Brewsies as well, but that was the first one in Boca. But that was also that was a brew pub. They didn't understand the concept that you would make beer and then you would sell it to a distributor that would then sell it to a retail spot. So they were confounded.
The super hard concept to get across to them was the sort of loophole, if you will, in the law that allowed for tasting rooms, which was because traditionally, and in a lot of states, alcohol is only sold through a distributor, period, end. You can't sell direct to consumer at all. And Florida had this exemption in the law that said, well, you can do a tasting room on site. And so and that was essential to our business plan, was being able to sell directly to the consumer. And so getting that through to the city council and getting that done was a major project. But
interestingly enough, thank you to Anheuser-Busch for that. There's a Busch Gardens.
Yeah.
That's while the city did not have anything production size, there were other breweries in Palm Beach County that were doing that. Correct. At that time. Were you able to get those breweries, and I guess maybe even those municipalities, to sort of talk to Boca? Was there any sort of cross-pollination? Did the county sort of step in, or was this dragging Boca City Council through the education, kicking and screaming?
The latter. It was dragging them kicking and screaming through the education. Really, it was.
Beat our own path. That was the only option.
Yeah, there was no county involvement with it, although we used them for examples during meetings with the Planning and Zoning Board. But this is Boca, and we don't do that sort of thing. And so it was a challenge.
How long did this process end up taking?
Over a year, just to get it approved.
That's amazing. And so you finally found a building, which, surprise, surprise, industrial park, obviously. You've got some recipes, you've got build out. When it came time to talk to the craft beer drinkers, more so, we'll start with the craft beer drinkers, because there were a growing group of people in West Palm, Broward, Miami-Dade, maybe up to Martin. So what did you do to reach out to them to sort of bring them in and say, yes, you are used to craft beer, but we're only going to be doing the specific style, and all of the things are going to be sort of within this umbrella? What was it like reaching out to them?
Nothing. We did absolutely nothing. We're not really active on social media at the time. We opened a brewery and believed that if we built it, they would come. And it's because none of us really have a marketing background in it per se. None of us are heavy social media users. So even before all the algorithms changed and everything is much, much harder, even on something like Facebook and Instagram, we weren't really utilizing it until we brought in companies to help us out with that. So we literally, listen, Bill and Matt and Keith had been active in the beer community for years. So going to bottle shares and meeting people. I'd worked as a head brewer at Funky Buddha, then at Due South, and then here. So I had a lot of connections. People knew me, people knew Bill, people knew us. So the word gets around. This is even back when the community was much, much smaller than it is now. So people came and tried the beers out, and people understood what Belgian beer was going to be. I think a lot of people that were uber craft beer nerds didn't really give us a chance early on because they weren't into Belgian styles. They didn't think that it would be all that interesting to have a quadruple or doing barrel aged beers. So I think we had a little bit of an albatross around our necks at some point early on because we weren't doing the most popular styles at the time, but people found us. Water finds its level. The people that love our style of beers found us through Google searches and word of mouth. And then eventually we decided we had to actually start doing marketing and actually running a business.
Was the marketing kind of when you decided, like, the beer people are here, now let's get Mr. and Mrs. Boca to actually show up?
That's right. I think to a large extent that is right. Yeah. There's just so far you can go with word of mouth, quote, organic growth. And then you start to plateau, and we had to get the word out. We found that there were people just down the road from us who didn't even know existed. And so that is the kind of people that we had to start reaching out to, is the people who just wouldn't normally investigate and look for a craft brewery.
And by the way, that still happens. There are people in the building next door that have no idea we exist. And it will always be that way, because unless you're following social media and being very active in the beer community, you're never going to see our posts. I don't know if you noticed when you pulled up, we can't have a sign on the building that says Barrel of Monks Brewing. So even though there's thousands of people that drive on Rogers Circle every day, they don't see us, right? So even though we're doing some marketing and we've been exposed on national TV before now. We've had tons of exposure, but it's still a very small group. If I was going back, and when I heard early on that brewers were opening up and they had a marketing budget of $150,000, I was like, "You're crazy! What are you doing that for? You're just marketing the craft beer community. You're wasting your money." it's the smartest thing. It's necessary now, because even at that time, getting through the noise of every other business that's trying to abide for your visibility online and social media, it's hard to break through that.
Gotcha. Boca traditionally has had a very large snowbird population. I had snowbirds in my family as well. And talking to other breweries that get affected by snowbirds, they tend to be a little bit more craft beer savvy, and they also tend to bring in samples and examples of what they're used to. Did you get a lot of that from people that were down for 6 months from New York, Massachusetts,
we certainly do. We get some of that. I mean, it's clear that our business picks up a lot in the winter, and I don't know how much of that is snowbirds. We can track sometimes where our customers are coming from, and so we find that there are a number of northerners, northeasterners who come in the winter, and so yeah, I do think we get some of that.
And we definitely have a lot of people. Any brewery will find its most passionate fans, and those people will come in multiple times a week. They mostly have relationships with like our taproom manager, Eric Sheffer, and our bartenders, because, Bill, I'm not in the taproom at all, really. Bill comes in for a lot of the events to make sure he's visible, because he wants to make sure he meets people and gets a chance to do that. I have a 5-year-old, so I'm out of here by 4:30 every day. So
I know the feeling.
But even that being said, we get people that will reach out on social media and say, "Hey, I dropped off 3 beers for you guys to try." And there's definitely an exchange of the passion of craft beer that happens through the tap room. And we used to do a lot of beer dinners, and I'd get a lot of people there that would, when I do my Old Favorite Friday videos, people will send beers in for me and say, "Hey, you should review this beer. You should talk about this beer." So there's definitely that sharing culture in craft beer is alive and well here.
So it's a good stopping point for this week. Next week, we're going to pick up where we left off, and we will continue talking about what they are releasing now and what's coming in the future. And with Barrel of Monks, they've always managed to keep moving ahead, not necessarily reinventing themselves as much as they are continuing to push forward and create new avenues for continued amazing success. If you want to know when that episode is getting released and you have not done so already, please make sure to follow us on social media. We are on Instagram, Threads, and X as Florida Beer Blog. We're on Facebook as FL Beer Blog, and on the internet at floridabeerblog.com and floridabeerpodcast.com. We are also proud members of the Florida Podcast Network. You can find them at floridapodcastnetwork.com to see all the shows that are coming down the pipeline that, trust me, you're going to want to hear. If you want to reach out for anything, feel free to do so at floridabeerblog@gmail.com, or follow us on the podcasting app of your choice. If you do, and you can, please give us a nice juicy 5-star review. It helps us get the word out, kind of helps feed the algorithm, makes things so much better, gives us more opportunity to reach more people. You may not get anything from it, but maybe a smile if I see you at Barrel of Monks next time. Our intro announcer is Jeff Brozovich. Executive producer for the Florida Podcast Network and Grand High Poobah is Jemmy Legagneur. Can't forget about Steve Pekala, our field producer, who is happily brewing in Coral Springs these days, which is nice. This is David Butler, your host and author. We will be back next week with part 2 of Barrel of Monks in Boca Raton. In the meantime, no matter what style it is, drink Florida craft.